Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today here at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My name is Rupal Mehta, and I am a senior fellow at the center, and I'll be moderating our lecture today. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome our speaker today, CGSR Deputy Director Michael Albertson. Prior to joining CGSR, Mike served for 16 years in the federal government, handling a wide variety of Russia, nuclear policy, extended deterrence, and arms control related portfolios within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the State Department, the National Security Council staff, and the intelligence community. From 2010 to 2012, he served as a policy advisor to the Senior Advisor for Arms Control and Strategic Stability to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, participating in the negotiation, ratification, and implementation of the New START Treaty. He holds a BA in International Relations and Government from Claremont McKenna College and an MS in Strategic Intelligence from the National Defense Intelligence College and an MA in Security Policy Studies from George Washington University. He is a member of the steering committee at the University of California's Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. Mike's talk today actually examines a recent CGSR publication entitled In Search of Strategic Advantage, Understanding the Landscape of Technology Competition, a collection of chapters from both CGSR research fellows as well as members of our joint postdoctoral research program with the University of California. In an era of seemingly ever-increasing global tensions, technology competition is often mentioned as a pathway for U.S. and allied success. And yet, beyond doing more across the board regarding technology competition is not all that simple. In this recently released CGSR Occasional Paper, authors look at different dimensions of this problem. Some of the authors look at dyadic competition between states, some explore the dynamics of technology competition between allies or adversaries, and others look at particular technological competition in fields like nuclear weapons, energy security, or quantum computing. But many of the questions and problems are the same throughout the work. These hard, fundamental questions about how technology competition works and what we should focus on as a country with our allies and within the national laboratories to achieve a meaningful strategic advantage through our competitive efforts. This talk will follow the format of other CGSR seminars. Mike will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will start the Q&A. During his talk, please feel free to get your questions ready, and you can start raising your hands electronically or typing questions into the chat while he is speaking. Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us today, and over to you.
So thanks very much, Rupal. It is a pleasure to be on this side of the screen as opposed to the presenter, and I appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and get the slides up. All right, can you see the slides okay, Rupal?
Yes.
All right, so let me start off by a big debt to my co-editor on this paper, Dr. Kimberly Pei, who was employed at CGSR for about 3 years, who has since moved on to other professional duties. But this was a paper, and as Rupal mentioned, it's a recently published CGSR Occasional Paper that is available in hard copy and on the CGSR website. But this occasional paper couldn't have been completed without Kimberly's help and her hard work on getting this project over the finish line. And I also am a bit of a phony in presenting this because this, like Rupal said, is the work of many talented people who wrote chapters at CGSR throughout the National Laboratory and also in our postdoctoral program with the University of California in Los Alamos. So I am essentially presenting their work, but I will attempt to draw Rupal and Dr. Caroline Wesson, who also does work in the area of technology competition, into the discussion when we get to the chat. So with that, we'll kick off the slides for today. Looking at the overview for this talk, this is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to essentially say, why this paper? Why did we choose to write this paper? What are some of the ways to look at technology competition like we do in this paper? What are some of the key takeaways? And then I'm going to go through the various chapters, the preface and the 11 chapters in the book. And I'm going to give you a snapshot of each one of them, because if you are working here At the lab in various aspects of strategic advantage and technology competition. There might be certain chapters that are more applicable to you than others. You certainly don't have the need to read this paper sort of cover to cover like a mystery novel. You should find the chapters that interest you. You should find the methodologies that you like, and you should focus on those because you have a lot of different perspectives on this problem. So why this paper? When you typically read the news about technology competition, you get sort of three different metaphors, three different historical analogies that are used. You get one, technology competition is like the Manhattan Project. We're gonna put sort of a whole of government S&T effort behind, doing something, making a thing that is going to give us an advantage in competition and conflict. Manhattan Project. The other analogy you get is a Sputnik moment, right? This is, we have had sort of a wake-up call that we are behind technologically, like we did when Sputnik sort of overflew the United States and people could look up in the sky and see it and see that the Soviets were ahead in the space race. And like, we are going to devote a lot of time, energy, and resources to sort of reinvigorating our S&T base. Or the Apollo program, right? Like we have we have picked a very hard technological problem. We are in competition with our geopolitical rival. There is a clear defined finish line, which is like putting a human being on the moon by the end of the decade, and we are going to devote a lot of time, energy, and S&T resources to it. So you have these three metaphors that sort of dominate the discourse. And of course, all the talk is about winning. Not losing, winning. We are going to win technology competition. This is a seminal moment, and we are going to win. And as somebody who in their graduate studies studied things like competition in military innovation or competition in military effectiveness, these narratives ended up to me seeming somewhat simplistic, right? You read about sort of military studies, and it was always not just sort of who has the best stuff, but there's a complex narrative of, well, how do you use it operationally? How do you use it on the battlefield? How do you incorporate it into your operations and plans? And so it's not simply sort of, who gets the best tank. And also this sense of, competition is hard. It's hard to define what winning is. It's hard to define where the finish line is. It's hard to define, are you spending resources in the correct way? And so it was like, okay, there's a narrative out there, and this narrative can be sort of improved upon or expanded upon through a bit of research work. And second, you see a lot of stuff in the discourse of, who is ahead and who is behind. And this chart that's up on the left was done by an Australian think tank on critical technology. Somebody used it in a recent CGSR workshop. And it basically shows like the US was way ahead. Now, according to whatever metric, this think tank is using, there was a certain point in time when China passed us, and now like China's way ahead, and so we need to catch up. And this to me was very reminiscent of studies done during the Cold War on US-Soviet competition, particularly in the nuclear domain. This chart on the right is one dating back to a report from the 1950s, which is basically the US was ahead, now we're kind of even, and the Soviets are going to be, hugely ahead of us in the future. And so if we don't get our act together, like we're gonna fall behind. Again, as you read through the literature, there's a lot of debate about, are we ahead or are we behind? Are we so far ahead that other people can't catch up? Or the Chinese so far ahead that we can't catch up? What metric are you using to define who's ahead and behind? Is it PhDs graduated? Is it patents done? Is it amount of money spent? Is it parts of the sectoral that we're devoting economic resources to? And so these sort of, again, this challenge in the narrative of like who's ahead, who's behind, how are we defining it? Again, seemed like it could use some more research work. There were also a lot of factors taking place in sort of the discussions that I was seeing here at the lab. We had been focused on a mission focus area called integrated deterrence and technology competition. This is one of the things that the director said, the lab essentially can if it puts its head together, it can sort of punch above its weight in this area, and it isn't now. So, we spent a lot of time in this mission focus area focusing on the integrated deterrence part of IDTC, but a lot less time on the technology competition part. So this, I thought, would be a good contribution to the technology competition piece of the IDTC mission focus area. And also, as we were thinking about this mission focus area, the mission focus area became redefined in the new administration to focus on strategic advantage, which, as we'll talk about, is sort of a great, big, interesting term, but again, one that requires a little bit more thought and exploration of like, what is strategic advantage? How do you achieve it? How do you know you have it? The external factors, some of which I've talked about in the previous slides, again, it was, well, we're competing, and how do we win? We win essentially by doing absolutely everything sort of all at once. We spend more money, we hire more people in every single technology. Here are the list of critical technologies. There's 30 of them. We're going to dominate in every single one of them, which again, in an era of sort of competition, scarce resources, didn't seem like a super realistic goal. There was a lot less conversation on how to spend finite resources than one would expect. Like, do you spend, and this often comes up in CGSR workshops, where are you going to get the most bang for your buck? If you have $10 billion, do you invest it in advanced manufacturing? Do you invest it in artificial intelligence? Do you invest it in, another laser? Like, what is going to give you sort of the biggest advantage or the biggest like catch up in a strategic competition with the other side? It's essentially like, well, we should do all of those things. Like, we have a lot of money in the United States. We should buy all those things, but of course that's not how budgets work, and that's not how things are spent. Oftentimes we talked about strategic competition sort of in absence of any understanding of sort of interactions between red and blue. It was a lot, the US should do this, or China is doing this, but not a lot of, well, if China does this, the easiest way for us to catch up is to do this. Or if we do this, China has a clear sort of second mover advantage and they can catch up to us relatively quickly. And again, you had a lot of these discussions, I feel during the Cold War when we were talking about economic competition, not just with the Soviet Union, but with our allies, with countries like West Germany, with countries like Japan, that were rapidly industrializing and catching up to us and surpassing us in a lot of technological areas. There is a big debate in the technology competition space about metrics, like what metrics should we be using to say whether we're ahead or behind, whether we're winning or losing. Usually it comes down to, I want to make a particular point, therefore I'm going to find a metric that makes the point that I want to make, that we're either ahead or behind. Or I want to explore this space, so I pick a single metric and I use that single metric to explain everything that's going on in this space, which again paints sort of an oversimplistic picture, and maybe you're drawing too much data from a single metric. And finally, there's a lack of consensus on what winning is, right? In some things, right, like the Manhattan Project, like when you successfully tested a nuclear device, thumbs up, like, and then you had a choice of whether to actually use it or not in World War II. The Apollo program, the space race, like when you landed someone on the moon, there was a clear finish line. But when you think about like computing in the Cold War, or microchips, or artificial intelligence, like what is winning? Like where is the finish line? And so when you say we want to win, what are you talking about? How do you define winning? What does winning look like in a competition that's probably open-ended for a long period of time? CGSR factors, we often ended up in workshops having a fair number of hard questions that would come up periodically about, this idea of technology competition, this idea of advantage, this idea of great power competition. How could we leverage some of our staff? And I point out Dr. Caroline Wesson, who's sort of up with the panelists, leveraging CSR staff to sort of deal with these problems. We had a strong cohort in this shared program that we have with University of California in Los Alamos, where we have a postdoctoral fellowship in technology and international security policy. There's 6 of them. They physically sit in Washington, D.C., but they come out to the lab. They've toured many of the facilities and institutes here at the lab that are of interest to them. But we found in CGSR workshops, whatever sort of discipline or field you were in, and we saw this a week or two ago when we did one on biosecurity, in every field, with a bunch of functional experts, you were getting sort of the same narrative from them, which is we are in a competition, mainly with China. The US has all of these competitive advantages in this competition. Venture capital, ability to attract international talent, you know, S&T base, academic partnerships, all of these competitive advantages. But all of them would say, but the US isn't really competing in a sustained and strategic way. We're not making smart decisions. And as a result, the advantages that we have are eroding, are slipping away, or are gone. And like we're either going to fall behind or are already behind and need to catch up. And so, a sort of a Sputnik moment, a reawakening is sort of needed. But is that actually gonna help? Like, haven't we had several Sputniks before in bio competition, space competition, cyber competition, name whatever functional area, and it really hasn't awoken us to the problem, and it really hasn't gotten us to get our act together. So having seen this enough times in a CGSR workshop, it was like, oh, maybe we can do a paper to drive a better conversation on this topic. So the whole point of the mission focus area was this idea that we could put together sort of all of these parts and make sort of the sum of the parts better. So the idea in this paper was, allow authors to pick what they thought was interesting in the realm of technology competition. So that includes, focus looks at quantum, at energy competition, at nuclear weapons. Have people focus on, in their chapters, dyadic competition between the US and an adversary. But also look at competitions like amongst allies. Like I said, this happened in the Cold War with the United States, West Germany, and Japan, who were sort of our biggest economic rivals, and yet our allies. But at the same time, everyone talks about Russia and Chinese partnership. They are competing with each other in certain technological domains. We are competing with our allies now in certain technological domains. There are also various means and methods of technology competition that are not simply like spend more, do more, win. And these include things like using export controls to compete, to sort of choke off critical things that the other side needs, to adapt, essentially, to see what the other side is doing, and perhaps emulate some of their processes or be a fast follower. And when I say fast follower, I mean, if someone else has done a lot of the hard work and resources and research before, you can essentially copy it, save all the time and labor and expenses of doing all that research, take what's already been done and sort of modify it and quickly do it yourself, or quickly leapfrog the other side because you see where the pitfalls are and you see what the next step obviously is. And then methodologies for assessing and exploring technology competition. So how do we use metrics better? How do we use various methodologies better to see whether we're competing effectively or not? So some of the big takeaways that we came up with. At the beginning, I was left with sort of more questions than answers. It's like you can do a volume like this with a lot of people putting a lot of time and energy and still realize like you have a lot of big questions and challenges in front of you. And these are all like open questions that I think sort of deserve more exploration. But, the big takeaway is sort of competition is different than just innovation. Like here at the lab, we do a lot of innovation. We want to be the first. We want to have like the biggest, the fastest, the best. We want to be out ahead of the field. But competition is different than that, right? Competition is between sort of two or more actors. Competition involves sort of finite resources. Competition involves, not just what we do here at the lab, but how are we leveraging external partnerships to further our work and things like that. Thinking about when do you want to be a first mover, thinking about when you want to be a fast follower, How do you choose and prioritize what you want to focus on, and what maybe you let the other side spend time, energy, and money on because even if they're first in that field, it's not going to give them a significant strategic advantage in some area. And then this big question, and again, getting back to this topic of sort of military adaptation innovation, it's not just like, do you have the thing or not? It's like, you have the world's fastest supercomputer, you have the world's most energetic laser, but how do you use those? How do you translate those things into a real sort of economic, military, technological advantage to achieve some sort of concrete national security goal? So we and the Chinese being in, a technology competition, when is the point in time when you actually will leverage that technologies for something? Is it a military crisis? Is it a leadership transition? Is it a diplomatic engagement? When is the time when all of this S&T stuff like comes into play in a meaningful way in which you're leveraging it? And in military innovation, that comes down to like when there's a war or when there's a battle, and all of a sudden, the things that people thought were going to be decisive aren't decisive, and things that people didn't expect to be decisive are all of a sudden sort of this central thing. And that's, submarines in World War I, that's aircraft carriers in World War II, that's drones, coming out of the Russia-Ukraine war. What are those kind of S&T things that we need to focus on? More big questions. So this is on this topic of strategic advantage. So strategic advantage is one of those, like whenever you put strategic in front of something, it immediately sounds, bigger, more important, more thoughtful. But it often fuzzes the thing up in terms of what does it actually mean. So you think of like strategic deterrence, strategic stability, strategic advantage. People say we want to achieve some sort of strategic advantage, which can be sort of like a big advantage or a meaningful advantage or a long-lasting advantage or something like that. This is a term that a lot of people use, but it is not a term that is well defined or understood in academic or expert literature. So if you are, talking about an advantage, how do you measure advantage? Its existence, its size, its duration. Where again do you choose to make investments to best achieve advantage? What are the roles of allies and partners in sort of creating and choosing advantages? People often talk about, allies are, our biggest advantage or something like that. And it's like, okay, well, how do you use allies? How do you use the private sector? If you see an advantage, is it better to sort of double down on a single advantage, or do you sort of bank that advantage and then use the money to expand into other areas? Is it better to compete symmetrically or asymmetrically? Like, if China is building a bunch of things, does the US need to build a bunch of things as well? Or does it need to sort of compete and move into a different area where maybe it's building fewer things, but they're faster, or, whatever it is. And then finally, sort of is this advantage only strategic if it's actually used? Is an advantage sort of meaningless if it's never actually deployed in some sort of way on the battlefield or anything like that? So the table of contents for the paper, as you can see, you've got preface, you've got sort of 11 chapters, you've got a variety of authors sort of drawn from CGSR staff, LLNL staff, and the UC postdoc cohort that we have in DC. But you see there's sort of a wide spectrum of topics, and I'll sort of briefly sort of touch on each one of those as I go through my remarks here, so you get a sense of the key arguments that some of the authors make. So the preface that I wrote mainly just talks about sort of why we did this paper, and there are a lot of very hard questions that need to be answered. And some of these questions are explored in this book, but this is not just, the preface wanted to make clear that this paper was not going to be sort of the end-all be-all in technology competition, because no one book is sort of the end-all be-all in technology competition. We've had a lot of great speakers at CGSR over the last couple years, because we sort of put a focus on technology competition and getting some speakers in on technology competition. So I'd highlight, Jeffrey Ding, who did a very good book on technology competition, is one of the speakers I would sort of call out. But there are very few authors, speakers who can really look at the entire landscape of technology competition in a single work. So there's a lot of good questions out there for people to do research on. This is an enormously interesting field. like we're going to look at some of these hard problems in this book, but we're certainly not going to answer all of these hard questions. So Dr. Anna Petzely wrote a chapter on sort of arms racing and nuclear weapons policy. She wanted to show, I think, how, you know, this idea of deterrence requirements, technology competition, was an important aspect of arms races, that technology competition did not necessarily equal sort of arms racing. Often these times become synonymous. Like if you were competing with China or Russia in nuclear weapons, it becomes synonymous with arms racing, which to many takes on a very negative connotation of, arms races are bad, nuclear weapons are bad, therefore why are we having a competition in nuclear weapons? But Anna makes the case that, some part of technology competition is about, making weapons, safer, more reliable. It's not all about sort of increasing lethality, increasing accuracy, driving arms racing and things like that. And she also does a bit to explore why there are a lot of people who are essentially taking the two-peer problem and what we're doing now with the Russians and the Chinese and sort of smacking, a Cold War legacy on it. But she explains like why these are actually similar in some respects, but often differ in other respects. So that's Anna's chapter. Dr. Eleni Ekbek-Soglu, who was one of our UC postdocs, she had done a lot of work on sort of military innovation and emulation. And so she talked about this idea of asymmetric competition. When you, see a rising power, they are often not going to compete maybe directly, but they are going to compete in an asymmetric fashion. This idea that you always need to essentially emulate what the other side's doing, like sometimes that works, but oftentimes states choose to compete sort of asymmetrically as opposed to saying, well, the other side is doing this, we're going to do the exact same thing that they're doing, and we're going to compete in that way. Actually, sometimes it works out a lot better to pick different ways of getting at the goal that aren't simply mirror imaging what the other side is doing. And she gives some lessons learned for how this might be useful in the US-China context, which again often gets boiled down to like we should simply emulate what the other side is doing. Carolyn Wesson looked at the problem of US export control policies and semiconductors. And her big contribution was this idea of sort of innovating around, that you put into place export controls. The export controls have a degree of effectiveness, and then the other side is invariably going to figure out ways to innovate around your export controls. This isn't to say that export controls are worthless. And that's kind of where some of the literature is getting boiled down to, of like, there is no point in sanctions, there's no point in export controls because eventually the other side gets around it. But the point I think Caroline is trying to make is that, with export controls, with sanctions policy, with things like that, you have a window of time that this buys you. Like, of course, effectiveness is going to decrease over time, but there are costs that the other side is going to bear in attempting to sort of innovate around. So you should like think of using this tool, think of how they're going to get around it, think of what time it's going to buy you, and think of what advantage it's going to give you from implementing this policy, but recognize that it's not a panacea that's going to solve your problem forever. Dr. Spencer Warren, who again was one of the UC postdocs, he looked at the issue of US-Russia technology competition. And he picked this area of hypersonics, where the US and Russia are competing, where 15 years ago, everyone was assessing that the US was far ahead in the competition, where Russia has now devoted a lot of time, energy, and resources to working on sort of hypersonic weapons, giving those hypersonic weapons a lot of press, and those hypersonic weapons and sort of generating a narrative of like, look how far Russia is ahead and we are behind in this area. And what Spencer does is he says, well, like, yes, you can look at these systems and Russia has tested them and they have these things and we don't. However, if you look at the strategic picture, like, does it matter that they're ahead in this one narrow niche area? Like, No, not really. They've spent a lot of time, energy, and money devoted to these systems to, evade missile defenses and those things like that. And maybe they have a slight technological advantage, but it doesn't really produce a big strategic advantage for them. And so, this is again is an idea that, can you encourage your adversaries to spend a lot of time and energy and money into things that will not actually give them a significant strategic advantage? But that requires sort of a bigger, broader analysis than simply looking narrowly at one particular technology and being like, well, they haven't, we don't, so we're ahead. They're ahead, and we're behind, and we need to catch up. Dr. Julian Krauss, who again was a UC postdoc, who now is down at Georgia Tech. He has done some really innovative work on looking at quantum technologies, and he looks in particular at this metric of patent data, patent analysis, because again, people are often forced to choose a metric to say, are we ahead? Are we behind? Whether that's PhDs that get degrees, whether that's government money spent, whether that's patent data. And he chooses this idea of patent data and he goes deep into it. Is it meaningful that China has more patent volume than the United States? And this again is something that's frequently cited as like China has so many more patents than we do, so they're ahead and we're behind. But I think Julian does a great job of actually looking at the data and saying like, well, let's dig deeper and see whether like numbers really matter in terms of patent data, or if there's other things that are actually more impactful and give it a bigger strategic advantage. So it's a great chapter for people doing sort of quantum technology analysis. And he's doing great work in the field, so certainly worth Googleable to see whether any of his other work is interesting to you. Energy technology competition, which again is something that we here at CGSR are doing an occasional paper on in the future, and Asmaret Askadam is leading that effort for us. But the narrative right now about sort of the U.S. is seeking energy dominance, and then that narrative of energy dominance sort of running into the realities of the conflict in Iran and what we see on global energy markets. But Asmaret, along with Ray and Brant, who are RAs here at CGSR Research Associates, looked at sort of the spectrum of technology, competition, and energy, and this idea that you cannot essentially be ahead in everything. There are some things you're ahead on, there's some things you're behind on, but how do you assess that you're keeping pace when you look at sort of the macro picture of where we are? And again, a big narrative in sort of the current conflict with Iran is, this is very much about sort of impacting fossil fuels and the fossil fuel market, and the countries that are more dependent on fossil fuels in Asia are suffering, and the countries that are less dependent on fossil fuels are actually managing to weather the storm okay. So again, it's like a very topical thing, and sort of I look forward to Asmaret and her co-authors' work when they come up with an occasional paper on this in the future. Dr. Kimberly Pei, who was a postdoc here at CGSR, who was the co-editor on this paper, she had a really interesting chapter on Russia and China sort of cooperation and competition. People often sort of boil alliances down to like, well, you're allies and you're always cooperating. And that, of course, is not the case. Even in a cooperative relationship, there's some competition, just like in a competitive relationship with Russia and China, there is some cooperation on certain areas. So she looks at sort of naval technology, where, Russia and China are cooperating in some ways. She looks at sort of one small thing, but also show where they are competing in this area, where there's internal frictions in what is often boiled down to like Russia and China are allies, they're cooperating in everything, to show if you look below the surface, there's often some competition between every cooperative relationship. Dr. Rupal Mehta, who's here, and I'm probably gonna butcher her work, and she's gonna clean it up when we get to the Q&A session. Talks about this idea of using emerging technologies for allied assurance. So we typically think of extended deterrence, assurance to allies as involving stuff, physical stuff like US boots on the ground in South Korea, Germany, you name it. Or we are physically selling, US weapon systems to our allies. And those are very tangible displays of assurance and extended deterrence. And Rupel explores this idea of, you know, technologies, of if we were in a cooperative relationship with allies, like some of this is going to be technology sharing vices like physical material stuff or US soldiers, particularly as we get into an environment with this administration, potentially future administrations, of moving from sort of burden sharing to burden shifting, where maybe the US is spending less time, with boots on the ground or putting US material on the ground. And instead we think about sharing technologies. There's benefits to this as Rupel explores, like technology is good. It helps allies in some way. It increases strategic advantage for us and our allies, but it is not a tangible thing. It's not a battalion of US soldiers. It's not a missile defense battery that people can look at, that you can write newspaper articles about with a nice picture. So there's sort of benefits and risks to this, and Rupel will explore some of that. Dustin Leake, who's here at the lab, who was generous enough to do a chapter, talked about this idea of sort of adaptation advantage. And this gets very much into what I was talking about at the beginning about sort of military effectiveness, is it's not just the stuff and having the stuff, it's figuring out how do you use the stuff to best effect? How do you integrate the stuff into your day-to-day operations to achieve some sort of meaningful advantage. So again, it's this idea of like not just having it, but like adapting it in a meaningful way that actually gives you advantage and leverage. And Dustin looks at it in his chapter. Ross Buchanan, Dr. Ross Buchanan, who's here with us at CGSR, he did a chapter on sort of wargaming. There is, of course, a lot of wargaming. Wargaming is super hot, and people are looking at sort of new technologies in war games. And so what they often do is they run the war game without technology X, and then they do another war game where it's like one side or the other has technology X, and they see the differences between sort of one war game and another war game. And Ross sort of looks at some of these war games and says, okay, like, is wargaming a useful tool? How do you use wargaming as a methodological tool to best effect? Oftentimes, it's not just the presence of a thing. It's, again, sort of how you use the thing and how you implement the thing. But for those interested in sort of wargaming and also thinking about how you can take whatever technologies you're working on here at the lab and like getting people's attention in the military and policy space, like wargaming is a great tool for that. And Ross can give you some pointers on like how to maybe use that tool for best effect. And finally, the last chapter was by Dr. Zach Davis, who was a longtime senior fellow here at CGSR, but also did a lot of work in Z. If you go to the CGSR website, you will see Zach did a series of papers on this topic of strategic latency. So he did 3 fairly large compendiums on strategic latency, which is a really interesting topic for people at the lab to explore. But this idea that like there are technologies that are sort of on the cusp of being real, that if realized will have sort of enormous strategic effects. And this can be everything from sort of bio to cyber to neural to physical to space-based, and he has authors that explore sort of all sorts of different dimensions. But this idea of thinking about strategic advantage of you have a technology that's on the cusp, and then you actually exploit it to increase its power relative to other countries, and then figuring out what to do with this exploitation. Like how do you actually use the thing? And so for those interested in this topic of strategic latency, like very, very cool chapter by Zach. And I'd recommend you read not just his chapter here, but also his other work at CGSR, because it touches on so much of what the lab does across the spectrum of things. So with that, I'll just repeat my thanks to my co-editor for all the contributors to this volume. And I would just say, this is an occasional paper. The occasional paper exists in paper copy over here in Building 170. Anyone can come and grab it. There's going to be an institutes and centers event in May. CGSR will have a booth there. People can feel free to grab it there, or they can just go to the CGSR website. It's there digitally, it's a PDF. And so I hope you enjoy this paper. I hope you enjoy other CGSR products, and Rupal very much look forward to the question and answer session.